In a few days, I'm going to be going hardcore into the successors of Alexander the Great and their wars for his throne. But until we get to that, I have time for one last politics video for 2018, and I decided to go back to my old series on the 2020 Democratic contenders. After all, I did make a somewhat foolish pledge to cover every single Democrat running in 2020. Little did I know that every Democrat in America was planning on running for president. But fortunately, there is at least one person who's being talked about who isn't a complete joke. I'm talking, of course, about Amy Klobuchar, who might actually have a legitimate chance. And even if her chances aren't great, she's at least worth talking about, unlike some other people like Michael Avenatti. So, without any further ado, let's look at Amy Klobuchar and her potential as a 2020 Democratic nominee. One thing that always helps a politician stand out from the crowd is having a story that people can relate to. And because so many people in politics come from affluent backgrounds, they can have a bit of trouble relating to average people. Amy Klobuchar didn't grow up poor by any means, but she certainly was not an aristocrat. Her background is very solidly middle class. Her mother was a second grade teacher, and her father was a sports columnist for a Minneapolis newspaper. So, she did okay, but she certainly was not rolling in the dough, and I don't think her parents owned any yachts or anything crazy like that. Amy Klobuchar was born in 1960, so during the 2020 race, she will be about 60 years old, and comparatively, that makes her one of the youngest candidates, actually. And that actually might be helpful for her since many people are concerned with the age of all the candidates who are over 70. In high school, she was her class's valedictorian. That's always a good sign. It means that she has some initiative. And this enabled her to get into Yale. If you just look at her background, she clearly did not have the family connections to get into there that way, so she had to actually earn her way in, unlike so many people who go to Yale. She graduated magna cum laude with a degree in political science, so that is a somewhat encouraging thing as well, since she actually has at least some training in political analysis, and she isn't just yet another random lawyer or another random business person. She then went on to the University of Chicago a few years later, and she earned her JD. And while she was there, she was an associate editor of the University of Chicago Law Review. So she's someone who not only came from modest beginnings, but got to where she is in life by having considerable brain power. And I think that's something that will resonate with voters, and it's something that will also help her to communicate more effectively during the primary debates. When I was looking at Amy Klobuchar's educational background, I pointed out that she's not just another lawyer. However, she is still a lawyer, to be clear. And prior to entry into politics, that was Amy Klobuchar's career path. She did some corporate law at one point, and she has experience in both kinds of laws when we're talking about law on behalf of the public and law for a private firm. She worked in the firms Dorsey and Whitney and also the Gray Plant Moody law firm. And as we'll see, she was also a county prosecutor in Minnesota. So fairly varied background when it comes to her legal career, and that is mostly a positive. Although anyone involved in corporate law, I'm a little suspicious of, but that is a very common background for a lot of candidates, including a lot of Democrats, so it won't make her stand out in a negative way necessarily. As we'll see shortly, Amy Klobuchar did not envision herself as a politician, and her initiation into politics was actually kind of accidental. But she was still a politically active citizen, and she participated in the Democratic Party in various capacities for her entire life. When she was still a student at Yale, Klobuchar was a member of the Yale College Democrats. She was also active in a feminist caucus, which is clearly a left-leaning political organization, and she performed in an improv troupe, which seems to have had some sort of feminist leaning just based on the name Suddenly Susan, And then at any rate, being in an improv troupe would really help her to hone her wit and her ability to think on her feet, which would be useful in both law and later in politics. Amy is also known for being very quick-witted, so this may have helped to really hone that skill in her. She also served as an intern for Senator Walter Mondale while she was attending Yale, so she's someone who wanted to have some connections within the party and do a little bit of activism for Democratic candidates she supported. As a senior at Yale, she wrote a senior BA thesis on the 10-year political struggle surrounding the construction of the Hubert H. Humphrey Metrodome in Minneapolis. So even as an undergrad, she was familiar with how politics actually works in practice, and she was never at any point a wild-eyed idealist. And that might have something to do with how, as a senator, she has been very successful at passing legislation, since even when she was a very young woman, she was aware of exactly how horse trading is done. So far as I can tell, Amy Klobuchar was perfectly content in her life as a lawyer, and she had no intention of ever really going into politics as a candidate. However, she accidentally became a political star in Minnesota. So what happened was that when she had her daughter in the early 90s, her daughter had a condition where she couldn't swallow. And this is something that was treatable, but obviously as a mother, you would want to be there with your child. But there was a law that Amy, as a new mother, could not stay in the hospital more than 24 hours after giving birth. So while her infant was being treated, she was forced to leave. And this didn't sit well with Amy, and she decided to use her skills as a lawyer to do something about it. So she actually appeared before the Minnesota State Legislature, and she successfully lobbied to allow new moms to stay in the hospital for 48 hours after birth. And this is something that passed in Minnesota, and Bill Clinton, as president, took notice of this, and he decided to take up the bill on a national level, and it is now federal law. So now Amy Klobuchar had a little bit of name recognition to go along with her legal reputation, and she was someone who people would approach about running for various offices. In 1994, an incumbent who Amy supported failed to win the DFL nomination, and the DFL is the Democratic Farmers and Laborers Party, and that's basically just what Minnesota calls the Democratic Party for no apparent reason. Anyway, so she briefly entered herself in as a candidate to be the Hennepin County attorney, but when the candidate that she wanted to be in office decided to run anyway, despite not having the nomination, she dropped out of the race and endorsed him, and I believe that he was able to reclaim his seat. Anyway, then he retired, and in 1998 she ran for and won this office in her own right. She was reelected in 2002, and apparently people were pleased enough with her performance that she actually ran unopposed. In 2001, Klobuchar was named as the Attorney of the Year by the magazine Minnesota Lawyer, and she also served as the president of Minnesota County Attorneys Association from 2002 until 2003. So while, being a county attorney is not a super high-profile job, she did stand out in the role, and she was recognized statewide for her performance in the role. So this sort of gave her enough clout that she could be considered a possible candidate for federal office, just skipping over things like the state legislature and state senate. I don't plan on getting too deep into the weeds about how she was able to win the 2006 Democratic nomination for the Senate, but it was a pretty easy race, and she was able to gain a lot of support early, and basically by the time that 2006 started, she was in line to be the candidate. If we look at how she actually performs in general elections, we see that Klobuchar tends to run very strong races, and she has actually never lost an election. So in 1998 and 2002, she won very handily in both of her Hennepin County attorney races, and actually, as I mentioned, in 2002, she actually ran unopposed. In her Senate races in 2006, 2012, and 2018, if we looked at numbers, Klobuchar won 58%, 65%, and 60% of the vote in each of those respective races. And my suspicion, as we'll get into later, is that this past election in 2018, she might have withheld quite a bit of money that she could have spent because she knew it wasn't necessary to run up the margin, and she was just building up her war chest for the presidential run in 2020. At any rate, she also holds the distinction of being the first woman to be elected from Minnesota. There was a previous female senator from Minnesota, but it was Hubert Humphrey's wife, and he actually appointed her to the Senate when there was a vacancy, so she was not technically elected. So, fun bit of trivia there. Of the innumerable things that piss me off about modern politicians, one of those things is how a lot of politicians will be very dodgy about their intentions when it comes to running for the White House. Some politicians try to pretend like they don't really want it and they're not actually that ambitious because they want to appear to be humble even though they're not. And then with other politicians, they don't actually plan the run, but they figure that if everyone else is going to run, they have to pretend like they're interested so that way they appear to be powerful and relevant. With Amy Klobuchar, she clearly intends to run, and she has not pretended otherwise, and I give her 100% props for that. That is a refreshing degree of honesty. She doesn't have to be cornered or anything like that. If you ask her if she's done a run, she pretty much just says yes, or at least very probably. So, much respect there. She's been someone who has been called a rising star in the Democratic Party for her entire term in the Senate, so going all the way back to 2006, so for the last 12 years, she has been someone who was reasonably high profile. There were a few articles back in 2014 which explored the idea of Klobuchar running for the 2016 nomination, and that speculation was nipped in the bud by Amy herself when she endorsed Hillary Clinton during the summer of 2014. Otherwise, that speculation was really starting to build, and she was starting to become one of the major names. Since 2016, now the Democrats are in, full panic mode looking for a new leader, there have been quite a few articles listing Amy Klobuchar as a potential candidate. Now, she doesn't get included in all of those CNN polls, but if you type in Amy Klobuchar 2020 on Google, you'll find a number of articles talking about her chances or including her in a list of potential candidates. And in interviews, she's been low-key open to the possibility of running for president for some time, and that includes prior to her endorsement of Hillary back in 2014. So this is not a secret. I would say, if anything, it's an open secret, and the only reason that it's at all secret is because the media tends to be fixated on the big-name candidates like Biden, Warren, Gillibrand, Booker, and Harris. And on the progressive side of things on the internet, the big name, of course, is Bernie Sanders. And it's just a matter of there being so many people that Klobuchar's name falls through the cracks. But she's sort of in the Sherrod Brown camp of being known but not being super famous, if that makes sense. And because of that, she might also share a certain distinction with Sherrod Brown of being in kind of a sweet spot between the limelight and obscurity, where her name is out there just enough that people know who she is and she doesn't seem like some rando, but also where she is not being micro-examined and picked apart and people aren't doing op research on her this early out. I think that might be something that works in her favor, but actually, I'm increasingly of the opinion that the massive name recognition and networking that Bernie Sanders has might end up proving to be an insurmountable advantage that other candidates will have a lot of trouble competing with. Anyway, let's move on and keep talking about Amy rather than Bernie. The issue of money in politics is of paramount importance to progressive voters, and it is definitely something that a lot of other people who aren't very progressive are at least aware of and starting to become concerned with. So it matters where you as a politician get your funding, because everybody now understands that politicians are beholden to their donors. And when we go through Amy Klobuchar on the issues, we will see a few instances where she very much is beholden to her donors, although for the most part that's not the case, because her donors are not super nefarious people. Anyway, the people who really give Amy a lot of money are law firms, retirement organizations, and women's groups. 50% of her donations come from large individual donors, read rich people, and 21% come from small donors. The rest, of course, would be PAC money. As of October 17, 2018, Klobuchar still had $5 million on hand in unspent campaign contributions. And I imagine she spent a little bit of that to finish out her campaign for the Senate seat in 2018, but I feel like she probably kept quite a bit on hand to use as startup money for her 2020 presidential bid. So she is in good financial shape going into the race. And while there are some problems with her voting history and her relationship with a few of her donors that we'll get into, for the most part, she's not nearly as vulnerable on the issue of money in politics as many of her potential competitors like Joe Biden. So this is not quite a strength, but not a weakness either. While I was preparing to make this video, I happened to mention Amy Klobuchar's name to one of my friends who once interned for Keith Ellison, and he said that he would never vote for her. And I was a bit perplexed because his politics line up with Amy Klobuchar fairly neatly, and he also has some connections to Minnesota. And he told me simply that while he was an intern with Ellison, he happened to meet a lot of Klobuchar interns and that they were perpetually stressed out and that they would complain about Amy's behavior behind closed doors. And apparently she's notorious for yelling at her interns and being generally difficult to work with. So this means that there could be about 14 years worth of former interns and staffers who have stories or vendettas that might prove damaging about Amy Klobuchar. Because if someone has a temper problem, they tend to say things for effect that they might not mean. And where I'm going with this is that Klobuchar may very well have said things that are offensive simply to piss someone off or get a point across, and those things might not actually represent her real views. But if someone decided that they preferred another candidate in the primary or in the general, they might decide to pull it out and let it be known. And because Amy Klobuchar will not be as heavily scrutinized in the primary as most candidates, simply because she's not quite as well known and because the field is going to be so incredibly crowded that there's not going to be a lot of deep background research going into this, this could be something that comes out late in a campaign and has an outsized impact, which goes far beyond the actual importance of this. And one thing that affects candidates is when their temperament is called into question. And I don't know how true this is in 2020, but historically, women tend to be a lot more exposed to critiques of their temperament, and they tend to be much more damaged by it than men do. So even though she would be running against Trump if she were to be nominated, this might come out and be used as a kind of false equivalency to make her seem equally unstable. So anyway, this is not a huge concern, but it's still something that I think is worth noting. When it comes to private behavior, it's a lot less important than one's public persona, and actually, Amy Klobuchar has a very positive public image. She comes off as very affable, witty, and down to earth. Amy insists that people call her Amy. She's very informal, very easy to get along with, at least when the cameras are rolling. And she's also very popular in Minnesota. As of October of 2017, during a poll, she was one of the 10 most popular senators based on their home state approval. She's also been very adept at generating favorable media attention. So as I mentioned earlier, there are a plethora of articles on how she should run for president in 2016, and now since 2016 there have been a bunch of articles about how she should run in 2018. There's also been press speculation that she could be a potential SCOTUS pick. I guess that was back when Obama was president. And there were also people on TV putting her name in the hat for the Attorney General's spot in 2014 when Eric Holder left the office. So the thing with this kind of press is that it is very positive and it helps to really build her up as someone who is worthy of just about any office. And I think that this public persona will definitely outweigh anything that she might have done behind closed doors. But again, we do have to be mindful of the fact that she does have a temper problem, and that will be a bit of a skeleton in her closet. Maybe she can make that into a personal story about how she had to overcome some issue. Certainly, she has the skills to spin it that way if she gets ahead of the issue early. Anyway, um, the fact that she's very good with handling the media and that she clearly has people writing puff pieces about her means that she will be able to spin any potential attacks, and that is very important. So let's just talk about Amy Klobuchar's pure ability as a politician when it comes to dealing with other politicians and being in the right place at the right time, reading the political tea leaves correctly, and all of that stuff. The ability to read the political mood is something that you can't teach, and you either have it or you don't, and Amy Klobuchar indeed does have it, unlike Hillary Clinton. Back in 2008, Amy had not committed her vote as a superdelegate until Obama won the Minnesota primary 66% to whatever Hillary got, and after that, Klobuchar pledged her superdelegate vote to him. Because of Amy Klobuchar's fairly well-known feminist views, it was likely that she was hoping to vote for Hillary Clinton in 2008, but Obama's convincing win in her home state made her decide to go for Obama instead. So this endeared her to her voters at home, who clearly preferred Obama to Hillary. And despite a bunch of speculation in early 2014 that Amy Klobuchar would run, she squelched those rumors early and really tried to build up the movement behind Hillary for 2016 by jumping on board with Hillary in June of 2014 by appearing at a Ready for Hillary fundraiser. Now, ultimately, she saw what way the party was going, and she knew that Hillary was doing everything in her power to rig the party for her to be nominated. And of course, Klobuchar is quite complicit in this by getting on board so early. But, she was one of the people who decided to become an ally of Hillary early and try to ride that wave. And her early support of Clinton was very typical of Democratic politicians, but it will make her vulnerable when it comes to trying to win over 2016 Bernie Sanders supporters, because most Bernie supporters are firmly convinced that the Democratic primary of 2016 was a complete and total sham. Another thing to note about Klobuchar's pure political abilities is that she is an excellent lawmaker. She is what Nancy Pelosi would describe as a master legislator. I like how Nancy always says "tor." Anyway, Klobuchar is a master legislator, and she has actually passed more bills into law than any other U.S. senator. So she clearly knows how to get other senators to jump on board with her ideas, and that is an important skill. Although, the more I think about it, the more I think that skill should just keep her in the Senate, and maybe she should replace Chuck Schumer. But anyway, it's going to be 2020, and everyone wants to be president because Trump looks vulnerable. So I guess she'll run for president rather than becoming Senate Majority Leader. So now let's look at the issues. What are Amy Klobuchar's stances on the key issues? I'll start with social issues because they're the least important, but in today's current Democratic Party, they are made out to be the most important, and there are even left-right spectrums where some morons have tried to put people on the spectrum based solely or primarily on their social issues, which is completely idiotic, but I digress. Her views are pretty standard Democratic views. She's pro-choice, pro-LGBTQ, and that's something that's absolutely vital for either being a Democrat or at this point even just a general election candidate. Social conservatism just doesn't sell anymore. If we look at the Republican primary of 2016, Trump was more or less on the left end of the Republican Party when it came to social issues, and that helped him more than it hurt him. So anyone running as a social conservative, especially within the Democratic Party, would be a complete fool. One thing Amy Klobuchar has spoken out about a number of times is the issue of cyberbullying. She frames it in terms of protecting our children from people online. Um, One issue where she did show that she can be a little bit of a corporate shill is that when the Obamas were pushing for the Healthy, Hungry, Free Kids Act of 2010, which basically was designed to improve the quality of school lunches, Amy Klobuchar decided to protect the frozen pizza industry of Minnesota, which was about a $3 billion industry, and force the USDA to count pizza as a vegetable. So this helped to undermine one of Obama's better initiatives, and this may very well end up incurring the wrath of Michelle Obama going forward. And because Michelle Obama has a considerable amount of clout in the media and with regular Democrats, if Michelle Obama indeed is angry at Amy, that could be a problem. I doubt she'll hold a grudge, but we'll see. At any rate, though, I don't know if any of you remember school pizza from back in the day, but the frozen pizza they serve at public schools is truly abominable, and students around the country would have been much better off had that pizza been cut from school lunches. Anyway, she is in favor of exempting people and companies in states with legalized cannabis from federal prosecution. I think she should go a step further and just say legalize marijuana nationwide, but this at least is a positive position, and it's one, again, that is very popular. She's pretty strong on the issue of gun control. She hasn't been one of the leading voices, but she's been someone who spoke out, and she participated in a filibuster on gun issues last year. I believe it was last year at least. And another issue that she's been very strong on is human trafficking, and in this issue she's actually been one of the leaders. Another thing that she did, which I listed as a social issue because I don't really know where to put it, is that she introduced the Commercial Felony Streaming Act of 2011. And of course it passed because it protects companies and their copyrights. And basically what this does is it makes it a felony to stream copyrighted materials for profit. And the bill is clearly written by and for the telecom industry and companies that protect their copyrights like Disney and Nintendo. So again, this is something where she talks a good game, but ultimately if she is paid enough money, she will go in a corporate direction. This I would like to use as an opportunity to point out that money in politics is a major issue, and we need to remove money from politics to maximize how well our government represents us. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox and we can keep talking about Klobuchar. When it comes to her foreign policy, Amy Klobuchar is more or less a standard Democrat. She was critical of the Iraq War back when it happened, and that's something that should go to her credit. But ever since then, she hasn't really taken a stand on any foreign policy issues that I'm aware of, and she doesn't seem to have a very distinctive foreign policy. So that will not be something that she would want to talk about in a primary, since she doesn't really have a very clear record on that. One thing that she has going for her, which might end up being very useful, however, is that she has spoken out about civil liberties a number of times, and this is something that has been woefully neglected by most politicians. Back in 2007, the Republicans managed to pass the Protect America Act of 2007, and most Democrats were shamed into voting for it under the so-called leadership of Harry Reid and Nancy Pelosi. One of the few Senate Democrats who had the guts to vote against it was Amy Klobuchar, and she said that this was on the ground of protecting the Fourth Amendment. In 2008, Amy Klobuchar also voted for a bill which, in part, banned the use of waterboarding. So, while being anti-torture is a pretty standard Democratic position at this point, at least Amy Klobuchar was on board with it when it was still a somewhat controversial issue. So these things will all redound to her credit, although, again, she doesn't stand out a lot for this, but just having spoken out about civil liberties at all is a good thing, and civil liberties, of course, are popular with people of all political stripes. So in a general election, if she was able to bring this up, this would be very helpful. One of the top 5 issues in pretty much any Democratic primary or national election is on the environment and energy policy. And in this regard, Amy does have one ace up her sleeve, or maybe not an ace, let's call it a 7 up her sleeve. She has passed bills to protect parks, and she has a very solid record on issues of conservation. She also identifies as an outdoorsman, and she likes to talk a lot about how her dad is an avid bicyclist. So these things, are all positive, and that helps her quite a bit. However, for the most part, when we look at these issues as a whole, she's very much a standard run-of-the-mill Democrat. Her official stance on energy is very reminiscent of Obama's all of the above approach. Basically, she is willing to work in a little bit of solar, a little bit of conservation, but mostly keep things more or less the same, just a little bit cleaner. So nothing drastic, in other words. And she talks about fighting climate change, but she doesn't get too deep into the weeds about exactly how to do that. So I would have to say that her mealy-mouthed approach to this issue could have 2 effects, one positive, one negative. On the positive end for Amy Klobuchar is that corporate donors will be more willing to give her money since she won't be calling for any drastic regulation of their activities. But and then also one other thing it enables her to do is to fearmonger to energy workers in especially places like West Virginia and Kentucky. Say if she were to come down to a duel with a progressive, she could then fearmonger to coal miners about candidates to her left trying to take away their jobs. Another vulnerability that she would have, though, is that the idea of a Green New Deal is really gaining steam, especially on the left. So if she were to say face off against someone like a Bernie Sanders in a one-on-one, I'm not sure how that would come to pass, but let's say it does, her left flank would be wide open and she would get absolutely hammered from the left on that. Not to mention that I can't really see her winning over too many informed environmentalists since there are stronger options in the field. So this could be a minor liability, but I think that the biggest liability is yet to come, and you'll see what I mean when we get there. In every election, the economy is probably either the most important issue or the second most important issue. It is never irrelevant, and economic performance often either helps or kills incumbents. So this is something that you have to be at least reasonably strong on to have any chance whatsoever, especially in a general election, but also in a primary. And Amy doesn't really have a clear record on a lot of the issues that confront American workers. But the record that she does have is fairly decent. One thing that is definitely in her favor is that she opposed the TPP because she worried about whether protections for American workers were strong enough. So that puts her on the same side as the Sherrod Browns and Bernie Sanders of the world. So that is a good thing for her, and it also enables her to use some populist rhetoric to appeal to Midwestern workers. She has a 100% score for the year 2017 from the AFL-CIO. However, while that is obviously the best score you can get, it was also the average score for Democratic senators in 2017. Whenever you have Republicans setting the agenda, it's pretty easy to come off as liberal just looking at your voting record, since all of the bills proposed will be anything but liberal. I would have to say that any Klobuchar victory scenario almost requires that economic issues are of less importance than normal. Let's say the economy keeps moving along and doing reasonably well. Therefore, the Democrats would be focused on some other stuff, and Amy Klobuchar's lack of strength in this area would not be a liability. Because if the economy is the major issue, or if wages and inequality are a major issue, I can't see Amy Klobuchar taking on Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, or Sherrod Brown. And now to explore Amy Klobuchar's Achilles heel, the issue of health care. Right now in the Democratic Party, everyone, or at least the vast majority of Democratic voters, are on board for going to a Medicare-for-all system. Bernie Sanders has won that debate completely. And even a majority of Republicans now support this policy. So if you're running in a general election and you don't run on the issue of Medicare for all as a Democrat, then you are a complete and total moron. There's no other way to put it. This issue is a slam dunk, and it would also, of course, have the added benefit of being really good public policy. At any rate, though, Amy Klobuchar has not gotten on board in the way that she should have. Up until at least 2017, she's basically avoided the issue of whether or not she supported Medicare for all. She's never been cornered with the question. She's never come out firmly and stated her exact position. Since the debate that we're going to talk about in 2017, she's stealthily gotten on board with Medicare for all, but she's not been very public about it because she's giving herself the chance to back out or to show her donors that she's not that serious about it. So remember when I said earlier that I admire her for being someone who doesn't play the will she or won't she when it comes to running? When it comes to Medicare for all, her embrace of it has been completely and totally disingenuous, and it's by way of implication almost. I mean, she's tried to distance herself from her own position, so it's really weak. She also seems way more comfortable defending the ACA and existing Medicare and Medicaid systems than going forward with a better solution to our healthcare issues. One thing where, once again, we see money in politics potentially being an issue in corrupting otherwise decent government officials is that Amy Klobuchar is a recipient of money from the Minnesota-based company Medtronic, and she demanded that they be exempt from an excise tax during a government shutdown debate in 2013. So she got a little bit of corporate pork while, the country was doing a budget bill and Republicans were mostly holding the government hostage. She decided to do a minor hostage crisis of her own. I doubt this will come up, but it could. And if she finds herself again in a duel with Bernie Sanders, this will become a major liability. And speaking of Bernie, Amy and Bernie teamed up in 2017 to debate two Republican senators on the issue of health care. And during that debate, Amy was pretty clear, if indirect, about how she does not endorse a Medicare for all system. She more or less called the issue of whether we should just repeal Obamacare or do Medicare for all a false dichotomy, and she listed just about every other possibility as plausible, but had no interest in Bernie's Medicare for all system. And that is what sort of got her called out about all that, and that's why she did the most half-assed, half-hearted embrace of Medicare for all ever, secretly, since that point. Anyway, I just can't imagine someone who is not really on board with Medicare for all winning when a lot of people say this is their number one issue, and it's something that pretty much all Democrats agree on as the course of action. For the progressive wing of the party, they would absolutely demand this as a purity test because it's a no-brainer. And I just don't see how she can overcome this. The other stuff I talked about, she could overcome. I mean, there are a few liabilities, but they're surmountable. This one, though, might be fatal, at least given the fact that she'll have to run against Bernie Sanders and a lot of other people who are more progressive. So, yeah, this is where she sees her aspirations burn up in flames. Just by way of conclusion, I would like to say that if we look at Amy Klobuchar as a whole, she has all the makings of a strong candidate, and it would be foolish to count her out or say that she has no chance. However, Medicare for All is the benchmark for progressive voters, and it's the key to ensuring a Democratic White House in 2020. And Klobuchar's weakness in that area looks fatal, both in terms of her ability to win the nomination and later to actually guarantee victory over Trump. She has a good story, good solid middle class background, and she has solid charisma, nothing that will set the world on fire, but certainly better than most. But in such a crowded field, what would she have to do to stand out as someone who is the leader that we're all looking for. It's hard for me to imagine exactly what would have to take place for Amy Klobuchar to really shine in such a crowded field. Also, she has a few gaps in her platform, some weaknesses. On Money in Politics, there are a few examples of where she has done the bidding of corporate donors. How does she explain that? And will she take a strong stance against money in politics? If she doesn't, and she doesn't attempt to explain the times when her hand got caught in the cookie jar, I can't really imagine her taking out better candidates. It's also hard to see her uniting either wing of the party, since both the progressive wing and the corporatist wing have far more orthodox options. The corporate wing wants Biden, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, and Kirsten Gillibrand as kind of their backup. Amy Klobuchar at best would be their fifth pick, and I don't think she would even be their fifth pick. The progressive wing, like I said, wants someone who is all for Medicare for all, and also someone who would be a lot stronger on environmental issues and money in politics. So I can't see Amy Klobuchar becoming the new choice of people who were enthusiastic Bernie supporters in 2016. That being said, she is still a solid candidate, even if she's not a great candidate, and I could actually see her being a VP pick for a number of the potential nominees because she could fill quite a few voids for quite a few people. As someone who's relatively young, she could balance out an old ticket. She could provide some Midwestern appeal to a ticket from someone from another region. She could provide a female presence on a male ticket. There's a lot of things she could do. And as someone who has a strong legislative background, someone who's good at passing bills, she would also be helpful as a balance to a ticket if one of the more inexperienced candidates were to emerge with the nomination. So I think that she will be a factor in 2020, but I don't see her becoming the nominee. Anyway, that's just, of course, my analysis of it. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And when we get to 2019, I will resume this series and cover the other Democratic candidates, of whom there are so very many.